Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a very slow journey into the warm desert nights of ancient Nubia. Imagine the stars above you, clear countless ancient blinking gently over the bend of the Nile. The air smells faintly of scorched herbs and river silt. Somewhere in the shadows of a reed hut, a woman hums a low chant as she grinds ash and resin into soot. She's not an artist, in the way you might think she's a healer. And tonight, her patient is a mother with aching hips and sleepless nights. The healer isn't preparing a potion or a bandage. She's sharpening a sliver of bone. She's about to tattoo her back to health. You're going to learn about the ancient people of Nubia and their quiet, fascinating relationship with ink skin and healing. And yes, it involves deliberate pain. But don't worry. You're safe, warm, and horizontal. And you probably wouldn't have lasted 10 minutes in a Nubian healing tent anyway. Between the chants, the puncturing, and the dusty heat you'd be faking sleep to get out of it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now imagine this. It's nightfall in ancient Nubia. The year doesn't really matter. A few thousand years ago, you're reclining on a woven mat made from river reeds. Your shoulder aches from carrying water jars all day, and the village healer has agreed to see you. She's old, quiet. Her hair is wound tightly in a turban, and her hands smell like crushed fenugreek. Her hut is small and full of gentle clinks. Shells, stones, a bronze bowl of charcoal paste. On a low stool beside her is a little basket. Inside are tiny sharpened bones polished flat on one end. A gourd of water sits nearby, soaking dried leaves and powdered bark into a bitter brown brew. You already know how this will go. First the herbal compress, then the chant, then the ink. This isn't body art. It isn't for beauty or rebellion. It's medicine. And her touch, though firm, is careful. She'll mark your skin not to decorate it, but to send medicine into it, to seal your pain away. You can almost hear the low hum she murmurs as she dips the bone in the soot. The Nubians were one of Africa's oldest and most resilient civilizations, stretching across what is now southern Egypt and northern Sudan. They weren't just builders of pyramids and traders of gold, they were meticulous observers of the body. Their tattoos weren't purely symbolic, they were functional. This was pain with a purpose. The healer leans in. She starts the first prick just above your shoulder blade, right where the ache lives. It stings, not sharply, but steadily. Her eyes never blink. Her other hand is steady tracing patterns learned from her mother and her mother's mother before that. She works by oil lamp light and instinct, her hum syncing with the crackle of the flame. Outdoors, someone is grinding grain. Someone else is laughing, probably too loudly. But here, inside this quiet hut, your skin is turning into a story, a remedy, a shield. The woman is deliberate with every mark. She knows which herbs cause the skin to puff slightly, to swell in just the right way. The ink she's using tonight is a mix of acacia resin soot and a pinch of crushed garlic bulb, a concoction meant to relieve joint inflammation, or at least ward off the spirits believed to nest there. Her chant changes rhythm. You're not sure what she's saying. It's in a dialect only elders use, but it doesn't really matter. You feel calm. Your shoulder throbs a little. But underneath, something settles. Maybe it's belief. Maybe it's biology. But that's the magic of this place, of this healer, of this gentle science. Outside the Nile glistens in the distance. The wind rustles the palms like someone whispering a secret. And under thatched rooftops, people drift off to sleep. Some with fresh tattoos blackened with healing ash guarding them from the inside out. The land of Nubia unfolds slowly beneath your feet. Dry ancient soil marked by the winding presence of the Nile. Its waters shimmer like melted bronze in the fading sun, bringing life to a region where survival has always been equal parts resilience and reverence. You are now in a world nestled just south of Egypt, and although it rarely gets the limelight in your high school textbooks, Nubia pulses with a proud and distinct rhythm. It's a land of gold mines, warrior queens, and knowledge passed not on papyrus, but in gesture, pigment, and skin. The Nubians, particularly, the people of the Kingdom of Kush, lived in a region stretching from present-day southern Egypt into northern Sudan. Their cities, Kerma, Napata, and Meroe, weren't just desert dwellings. These were trading powerhouses, skilled in metallurgy, ceramics, and governance. They controlled access to gold, ivory, incense, and exotic animals commodities Egyptian pharaohs desperately wanted. This created a complex dance between rivalry and cultural blending. And over time, tattooing wove itself quietly into that shared fabric. Tattooing in Nubia was not the exclusive domain of aesthetics. It wasn't just for the fierce or the rebellious. Here in this sandy cradle of civilization, tattooing had meaning rooted in medicine protection and sacred story. You might imagine a bustling market in ancient Meroe. Bright pigments, woven fabrics, and scented resins fill the air. And nearby, in a quieter alley, a healer prepares a patient. But this isn't a doctor's visit in the modern sense. There's no sterile room, no clipboard, no antiseptic. Instead, it's the whisper of a chant, the scent of crushed herbs burning gently on charcoal. A woman sits cross-legged, her back exposed, as the healer hums and dips her needle in a thick, dark pigment. This moment, this act is not rushed. It unfolds like time itself has softened. The tattoo is both a remedy and a prayer. So how did a practice like this emerge in Nubia? Well, geography is everything. Because Nubia sat between sub-Saharan Africa and Egypt, it absorbed knowledge like a sponge. And while the Egyptians leaned toward visual storytelling through hieroglyphs and massive stonework, the Nubians favored oral tradition and symbolic bodily art. Their culture was deeply spiritual, one that believed in the presence of unseen forces, gods, spirits, ancestors, and even illnesses that weren't simply infections, but intrusions from other worlds. The body wasn't just flesh. It was a map, a protective shield, and occasionally a battlefield. Illness, then, was never merely physical. When a child experienced seizures or a woman endured chronic womb pain, the Nubians didn't always look for wounds. They listened for spiritual disharmony. And one of the most powerful tools to restore balance was ink. By embedding symbols into the skin, especially over the source of pain, they believed you could ward off the hostile forces responsible. You didn't just wear art, you wore a defense system. The placement of these tattoos was never random. If someone suffered from persistent headaches, you might find dark dots along their temples. If their joints ached, ink would adorn elbows, knees, or shoulders. Women preparing for childbirth might receive tattoos low on their abdomen or inner thighs, places both symbolic and functional. And though we can't hear their voices anymore, we still have the markings. Thousands of years later, long after the chants have faded, those careful dots and lines still speak from desiccated skin. Interestingly, Nubian society placed great trust in women as medical practitioners. Healers were often older women, experienced in childbirth herbal treatments and therapeutic tattooing. These weren't roles pushed to the margins. They were essential. Their authority came from knowledge passed down through generations, stored not in books, but in memory ritual and practice. And in these healer women's hands, tattooing became more than a procedure. It was an act of care. Tattooing ceremonies were sometimes public and celebratory, especially when they marked transitions, puberty, marriage, or motherhood. Other times, they were deeply personal. A woman recovering from miscarriage might receive a protective mark on her belly. A warrior healing from injury could request a strength symbol near his scar. These were moments not for spectacle, but restoration. A kind of healing you could see and carry with you. And then, of course, there was the desert sun. Life in Nubia meant life in heat, dust, and wind. Your skin aged quickly, weathered like stone. And in such an environment, tattoos weren't just visible, they were declarations. They could show identity strength, community, even allegiance. A certain curve on the wrist might indicate clan affiliation. A dot over the sternum could signal religious devotion. These were personal archives written in the language of skin. And all of this, the pain, the pigment, the ceremony took place not in some sterile, hushed room, but in open spaces, near firelight, under starlight, beside running water. The natural world was always close, and in this intimate relationship between environment and body history was written not with ink on paper, but ink on skin. So tonight, as you drift through the slow flow of Nubian time, remember, healing wasn't just about fixing a broken body. It was about restoring balance between seen and unseen worlds. It was about whispering to the ancestors through symbols. And sometimes, it was about leaving a mark not to be noticed by others, but to be felt by you. You shift slightly beneath your blanket, letting the low hum of history carry you further. And now you find yourself walking through the warm, sun-cracked pathways of an ancient Nubian village. The light is soft and amber, the Nile glimmers in the distance, and the air is scented with resin and dry earth. It is here in this slow-moving world that you meet the heart of healing in Nubian society. Not a man with a staff or scrolls, but a woman with steady hands, a quiet chant on her breath, and knowledge passed down not through books, but through memory and touch. Nubia's healers were often women, respected, matriarchs, midwives, herbalists, and ritual specialists, all rolled into one. They weren't draped in gold or seated in courts. They lived among the people, surrounded by family and responsibility. Their tools were humble bundles of herbs, pouches of ash, polished bone needles, and hands that had soothed hundreds. These women were the quiet authorities in matters of pain, spirit, and recovery. You see one now, her hair braided tightly back, eyes dark, and observant skin etched with faded ink from years past. She wears a simple linen wrap. On her forearm, 3 dots in a straight line. One for healing, one for protection, one for passage. Each tattoo earned, not adorned. She moves with purpose, gathering resin from a pot, crushing a dried root, muttering softly to herself. Not a spell, exactly more like a prayer stitched into the air. In Nubian tradition, healing wasn't something that came from outside. It came from within and needed only to be guided. Women were seen as natural vessels of this inner power. Their roles in childbirth and family care extended seamlessly into medical responsibilities. If a child fell ill with fever, it was the healer woman who would brew a tea from acacia and charcoal. If a labor dragged on painfully, it was she who would rub tattooed oil across the belly and press her fingers to the points marked by generations before her. Their knowledge was empirical, but also intuitive. They knew which plants cooled and which burned. They knew which days were good for rituals and which days were not. And more importantly, they knew that healing was never only physical. It was layered spiritual, social, and emotional. When a person cried from pain, the healer didn't just look at the wound, she asked about the dream that preceded it, the omen seen, the feeling behind the ache. Tattooing in this space was an extension of that belief, a practice not of decoration, but intervention, a way to speak to the body's rhythms using ink and puncture to draw symbols over places of pain or vulnerability. For example, women often received small geometric tattoos on the inner thighs or lower back to ease menstrual cramping or assist with childbirth. Some were circular, some were spiraled. None were random. They had been tested over generations, inked by memory, trusted like maps. The tattooing itself was not always solitary. A young girl receiving her first healing mark would be surrounded by women, her mother, her aunties the healer, and sometimes even the village elder. A small fire would burn. Soot was stirred into oil. Incense drifted through the room. A chant would begin, not loud, not sharp, just a low melody that made everything seem slower, like the sun hesitating before setting. The healer would dip her needle, sometimes bone, sometimes copper, into the mixture and begin. The mark might be 3 dots along a knee joint that had begun to swell. Or it could be a line beneath the rib cage where tension gathered. Each stroke was a message sent through the skin. Here, heal here. The women learned from their mothers and their mothers before them. There were no written texts, no inked diagrams in scrolls or tombs. Everything lived in the hands. Everything passed down by doing, watching, and being present. And because of this, each healer carried not just her own experience, but generations of remembered pain and comfort. A lineage of empathy. Their tattoos were more than medical, they were deeply personal. A woman might bear a mark to signify the child she lost in childbirth. Another might wear symbols for safe passage across the Nile during times of war. Some tattoos had no direct explanation, at least not one she'd share. The meaning was private, sacred, stitched into her spirit. And still, despite their quiet power, these women were not glorified. They were not enshrined in marble or mentioned in heroic decrees. Their work was modest, invisible to outside historians for centuries. Only in the last 100 years have archaeologists begun to read the skin of ancient Nubian mummies as if it were a scroll. Only now are we beginning to understand that these marks weren't meaningless patterns, but living medicine. As the stars climb above the Nile once more, you watch the healer press her hand over the newly inked skin of a young girl. She hums a note that feels older than the earth. She nods not to the girl, but to herself. The work is done. The body has been spoken to. The pain now will know its way out. And just like that, you slip deeper into the rhythm of breath, soothed by the presence of this ancient quiet wisdom. The tools, bone needles, and burnt herbs. You can almost feel it, the dry heat of the Nubian night slowly fading, replaced by a breeze that glides in from the Nile like a whispered lullaby. Nearby, in a small circular hut, made of woven reeds and mud, a healer kneels beside a flat stone, carefully grinding something between her fingers. The scent of burnt resin and dried herbs hangs in the air. She is not hurried. She is not loud. Her motions are slow, measured quiet, as though she's speaking to the air itself. Tonight, she is preparing the tools that will bring relief to another woman's aching joints, to another child's lingering fever. These tools are no mere decoration. They are deliberate instruments of healing, and they begin with bones. In ancient Nubia, tattooing was not performed with metal needles, at least not in the early centuries when the practice took root. Metal was rare and costly. Instead, they used small sharpened fragments of animal bone, sometimes from birds or fish. These bones were lightweight, fine-tipped, and surprisingly resilient. To the untrained eye, they might seem too simple to pierce human skin. But in the hands of a practiced healer, they became precision tools, extensions of the fingers themselves. The bone was scorched, first hardened in a fire. Then it was cooled and polished by hand. Each tool had to be inspected. If the edge was jagged or the point chipped, it was discarded. The healer would not risk infection. She would rather spend another night carving a fresh needle than harm the person she was called to help. Next comes the pigment. The base ingredient was soot collected from the bottom of cooking pots or oil lamps. Not just any soot, though. Some healers preferred soot from specific woods, like acacia or tamarisk, which were thought to carry protective properties. Others added powdered herbs, burnt myrrh, dried papyrus, or crushed desert flowers ground so fine they became dust in the moonlight. All of this was mixed with a thickener, often oil or animal fat. Some used resin from local trees to help the ink bind to the skin. This mixture was left to sit often overnight, absorbing the energies of the room the chants whispered during its creation and the intentions of the woman preparing it. You wouldn't dare rush it. A rushed ink is an ink without power. Once the ink was ready, it was stored in a shallow pottery dish, its surface shimmering darkly under firelight. A small stick or feather quill was sometimes used to dip and apply the ink to the skin before the needle met its mark. But this wasn't the only tool in her kit. The healer also had flat stones for grinding cloths soaked in fermented plant water to sterilize the skin and gentle balms to cool the flesh afterward. Aloe was common. Honey, too, its sweetness not for taste, but for soothing wounds and keeping infection at bay. If she was traveling to a neighboring village, she would wrap everything in woven cloth and carry it in a basket on her back. Her steps unhurried, her mission clear. It's easy to imagine her kneeling by the fire, surrounded by sleeping goats, murmuring old chants as she sharpens bone against stone. Her fingers are stained black from soot. Her breath smells faintly of mint leaves she chews to stay alert. She knows each patient by name. She remembers who needs a tattoo for hip pain, who struggles with fertility, who carries the grief of lost children in their bones, and wants anything, to feel better. The process of making these tools was not just functional, it was sacred. Some healers believed the bones had to come from animals that had died, naturally, never hunted, never slaughtered. Others insisted on burying the finished tools overnight, letting them absorb the earth's cool energy before being used. You didn't just make a needle, you raised it like a child with patience and care. The soot itself was sometimes consecrated. A healer might whisper a prayer over the flames as she collected it. She might stir it counterclockwise if the tattoo was to ward off evil, or clockwise if the goal was healing or rebirth. Each direction, each movement had meaning. And when the tools were ready, when the bone tips were sharp, the ink was dark and thick, the air in the hut humming with intention, she would extinguish the lamps and rest. The tattoo would come with the next sunrise, when the world was warm and the skin soft, and the pain might be lessened by the laughter of birds overhead. You can feel it now, the rhythm of preparation, the calm, the stillness. Every part of the process slow, deliberate, infused with purpose. This wasn't a beauty ritual. It wasn't decoration. It was medicine. And like all good medicine, it began with attention, with time, with love. The woman lies still, her arms weathered by the sun, and softened by she are folded across her middle as she breathes through her nose, slow, steady. Just above her right knee, a single dot marks the beginning. The healer leans in with quiet confidence, her hand firm, her tool steady. It's no longer a sharpened thorn, but a slender bone needle delicately honed. The ink thickened with soot, and plant resin waits in a small clay dish. This is not decoration. This is pain with purpose. You probably won't survive this, not if you're used to soft beds and painkillers. The tattoo process in ancient Nubia wasn't about beauty, not even primarily about status. It was medical, and it hurt. But in a culture that didn't separate the physical from the spiritual, that pain was part of the cure. Now imagine the healer pressing the point just under the skin. Not deep, just enough to let the body drink the ink. A dot, a line, a series of repeating geometric patterns. She moves slowly, there is no rush. Each mark is intentional placed, according to long-learned knowledge passed from older women in the village, guided by herbal teachings and spiritual visions. These weren't randomly chosen symbols. They corresponded to energy lines, to joints, to pain centers, what we might now call acupressure points. Many of the tattoos were clustered around high pain areas, knees, shoulders, lower backs. These were joints that carried strain from daily labor, grinding grain, hauling water, working fields. A row of dots along the spine could signify protection from chronic aches. A sunburst near the ankle might help reduce swelling. Down the inner thigh, yes, even there patterns were inked to ease menstrual pain or assist childbirth. If you're imagining something like a modern tattoo parlor, erase that. This was an act performed often in open air, perhaps under a cloth canopy, if the sun was too fierce. It took place at dawn or dusk liminal hours, where the world shifted between the visible and the invisible. It was not quiet, but it wasn't loud either. The patient might hum, breathe rhythmically, or speak to the ancestors. The healer might chant softly with each press of the needle. Children might watch wide-eyed from a respectful distance. And it wasn't just the ink that healed, it was the process. The intentional wounding of the skin was believed to let out bad spirits or open channels for good ones. In some cases, illness was thought to be trapped under the surface. By piercing the skin, they were releasing it, letting it fly back to the river or into the wind. That pain was the threshold. To cross it was to participate in your own healing. Let's pause there. The cultural understanding of pain is so different here. In Nubia, pain was not just a symptom. It was a message, a rite, even a kind of sacrifice. To endure the tattoo was to engage with your body's distress actively, not hide from it, not medicate it away, but confront it head-on. The marks that followed were not scars of suffering, but signatures of strength. Many of the patterns were simple. Dot clusters, zigzag lines, crescent arcs. Some traced along tendons or bones. Others circled areas believed to house energy or spiritual tension. Every healer had her own variations, but the core principles remained. Tattoos were not random. They were carefully mapped to pain, fertility, and protection. In one village now, only ruins their outlines visible in satellite photos. Archaeologists found bone needles and ink pots, buried alongside a woman whose arms were patterned from wrist to elbow. Her pelvis bore circular inked designs, now only faint scars in the mummified skin. They believe she had given birth many times. Perhaps she was a midwife, or simply a woman who knew pain intimately. The tattooing process was not always done in one sitting. Sometimes it was stretched across days or even seasons. The body needed time to rest, to respond. The healing process mattered just as much as the marking itself. Herbal poultices were applied afterward, mixtures of marula crushed mint or fermented resin to soothe the inflammation and keep the spirit aligned. People didn't always seek tattoos when they were sick. Often they came when they felt the sickness approaching. A dull ache, a heaviness, a whisper in a dream. The healer would feel the patient's skin look into their eyes, ask about their ancestors. And then, perhaps, she would prepare the ink. Back to our woman under the night sky. Her tattoo is nearly done. A line of 7 dots curves gently along the side of her calf. She winces. The healer pauses, offers her a carved gourd of cool water. They do not speak. They do not need to. Pain with purpose has its own language. When the last mark is placed, a soft cloth is laid over the fresh tattoo. A chant, low and slow, marks the end. The woman is helped to her feet. She limps slightly but smiles. The pain has not left her body. Not yet, but now it has been seen, touched, met with action. In Nubia, that is the beginning of healing. The ink that healed. Let's settle back now into that warm Nubian twilight, where the air still smells faintly of wood smoke and dried herbs. You can almost hear the rhythmic grind of a stone mortar as a healer slowly prepares her ink. There's nothing rushed here. Every gesture is practiced, every movement gentle. This is not ink made for art or vanity. It's ink designed to soothe, to mend, to protect. Ancient Nubians believed deeply in the healing power of natural substances. Much of their medical understanding came from observing the earth around them, how the sap of certain trees could close wounds, how the bitter leaves of a plant could ease stomach pain, or how oils drawn from resin might cool a fever. So it makes perfect sense that when they created tattoo ink, they turned to these same trusted materials. The base of the ink was often charcoal or soot, usually from burned acacia wood or other sacred plants. This soot wasn't just any ash, it had to be collected carefully, ritually even. It was often mixed with powdered herbs known for their medicinal or purifying effects. Think of dried frankincense or powdered henna root, or even desert thyme, strong, fragrant things crushed to dust and added to the soot. But ink alone wouldn't do. To make it bind and flow, healers used natural resins or oils, maybe the sap of a fig tree, thick and sticky, or diluted honey. Some even used animal fats or marrow oil, creating a salve-like blend that was as much balm as pigment. This not only carried the herbal properties deep into the skin, but also helped soothe it after the needle had done its work. Let your mind drift now to a scene. A woman, perhaps suffering from pain in her hip, lies on a woven mat. A healer leans over her, gently whispering a prayer as she dabs the blackish ink onto a small area of skin. The tattooing begins small taps with a bone-tipped tool. Slow, methodical, soft. The pain is real, but it's purposeful. With each tap, that healing ink is pressed under the skin, into the places that ache, into joints burdened by age or childbirth. And it didn't stop with bones and joints. Women with chronic reproductive pain, for example, might receive tattoos just below the navel. Small dots or lines infused with herbal soot, meant to ease menstruation or strengthen fertility. Sometimes the ink was even mixed with crushed pomegranate seeds or powdered ochre ingredients believed to bring warmth and circulation to the womb. In a culture where touch, chant, plant, and spirit all flowed together, the tattoo ink was both physical and spiritual. It carried the memory of the plant's healing power, the breath of the chant spoken over it, and the belief that this mark was a shield against pain, against loss, even against dark spirits that might try to enter through the skin. It's not hard to imagine that for the Nubians, this was less like medicine and more like magic. Not magic in the flashy performative sense, but in that deep, quiet way that so many ancient peoples understood the body as part of the earth, marked by its gifts, restored by its hidden chemistry. The ink didn't just treat the wound, it became part of the skin's story. It was both a memory and a remedy. Over time, those tattoos would fade slightly under the African sun, but the meaning endured, and the body, scarred, pigmented, transformed, carried its healing wherever it went. Even in death, the ink stayed. In tombs and burial pits, beneath cloth and dust, these marks are still being found, still whispering their purpose to modern archaeologists, peering under ancient wrappings. You might not find these recipes in modern pharmacology books. There are no lab-tested studies on acacia soot tattoos for arthritis, no peer-reviewed data on henna and honey ink for uterine pain. And yet, the people who wore them swore by their power. They returned to their healers year after year for new treatments. They passed the rituals down through generations. In a world with no painkillers, no surgery, and no hospitals, tattooing wasn't a last resort. It was a front-line treatment, ritualized, trusted, and shaped by centuries of observation and belief. So next time you hear someone say, tattoos are just body art, just decoration, you might think back to the banks of the Nile, to that healer grinding her soot, to that woman lying in stillness, placing her body in the hands of ink and plant and prayer, and to the gentle hush that falls after the final tap of the needle when the healing has begun, not just on the skin, but somewhere deeper, quieter, and much more ancient. You wake slowly still under that same Nubian sky, as the air thickens with the perfume of warm, desert wind. The stars have shifted ever so slightly. Someone is humming nearby. You blink and realize it's not just one voice, but many. Low, rhythmic, like the Nile lapping at its banks. Tonight is a special night, not for war, not for the dead, but for something older, the art of placing sacred marks upon the body. And tonight, it's a woman's turn. In ancient Nubia, tattooing was never just body decoration, it was biography, medicine, prophecy. And for women, it was especially powerful. You can almost feel the gravity of this moment as the healer traces lines along her subject's thigh. These aren't random markings. They're carefully chosen symbols echoing generations of wisdom passed from mother to daughter, midwife to apprentice. You notice that most of the marks seem centered along the lower abdomen, around the thighs, the inner arms. These were more than aesthetic placements. They pointed to areas associated with womanhood, menstruation, pregnancy, birth recovery. Some tattoos represented fertility, a basket overflowing a series of concentric ovals that mimicked seeds or wombs. Others were protective amulets, meant to shield a woman during childbirth, or to strengthen her against miscarriage or infertility. But not all tattoos were visible. Some, like those along the spine or beneath the breast, were known only to the wearer and her healer. These secret marks were believed to whisper directly to the spirit world, offering quiet pleas to protective ancestors, or rebuking malevolent forces that caused internal pain. A woman's body was a living, healing manuscript, her story etched in soot and bone. Imagine one woman, a mother of 4, long recovered from a difficult 5th pregnancy. She comes tonight not out of vanity, but because her pain has returned. A dull ache in her belly, persistent and stubborn. Her healer does not write her a prescription. Instead, she reads the woman's body like a map. She listens. Then she prepares the pigment. A series of dots will run just below the navel. They're shaped like the paws of a lioness, the ancient protector of birth. Along the hip, a small spiral representing life continuing after pain. and on the inner wrist, a cluster of vertical lines. This is the mark of the herbalists, a symbol that soothes and cools. These tattoos are not applied in haste. The process is unhurried, deliberate. The healer hums as she works. The patient breathes through the sting. The pain is sharp, yes, but it fades quickly. And afterward, there's a feeling of lightness, of something released. Women often described it as feeling less burdened, as if a heaviness had been pulled from within. Some marks also offered social strength. In communities where lineage and fertility mattered deeply, a tattoo could silently declare a woman's experience, how many children she had birthed, survived, or lost. It was a record of her endurance, a form of resilience inscribed into the skin. But not all meaning was so public. Some symbols were deeply intimate. A small dot beneath the collarbone might signal mourning for a lost child. A curving line near the ear might reference a specific prayer whispered during childbirth. To those who knew, these marks spoke volumes. To others, they passed unnoticed. Tattoos were also part of coming-of-age ceremonies. For adolescent girls, the first ink often coincided with the onset of menstruation. The marks were usually small, a sunburst near the ankle, or 3 dots near the elbow. They served both as spiritual protections and social markers. This girl was no longer a child, and as women aged, they added to their ink not always to reflect beauty, but to honor experience. A grandmother might carry marks no longer fashionable but rich in personal history. Her skin told the story of her journey, aches survived births, endured spirits thanked. It's worth pausing here to consider the sheer intelligence woven into this practice. This wasn't random. This was a system of meaning, of language, a medical spiritual hybrid created and sustained entirely by women. Imagine the quiet moments years later when a daughter would sit beside her mother, tracing these symbols with her fingers, asking, "What does this one mean?" And the mother would smile, brush a hand over her knee and say, "That was the year I almost died, but I didn't." You close your eyes and listen to the steady voice of the healer still humming. She's wiping the final mark clean. The woman sits up slowly, careful not to smudge the fresh soot. There's a bowl of cool water beside her. She drinks, and though she still winces slightly from the ache in her lower belly, she breathes differently now, freer, and you feel as though you too have been marked not with ink, but with understanding, with the slow realization that in this world pain was never hidden. It was worn with dignity. It was healed in ink. The oil lamp flickers again. Its small flame dances against the sandstone wall, as if responding to something unseen. You're lying near a fire pit, just outside the healer's hut. A steady desert breeze rustles the woven reed curtain. Inside, a woman kneels beside a younger girl whose arm has been marked with fresh dots along her inner elbow. Tiny, deliberate tattoos meant to ease the fevers that have come and gone like moon cycles. But tonight is not just about medicine. Tonight is about warding off the things you cannot see. In ancient Nubia, sickness was rarely just sickness. A fever could be heat from the sun, or it could be the touch of a wandering spirit. A stomachache might come from spoiled lentils, or from a curse muttered by a jealous neighbor. And so healing could not be complete without also addressing the spiritual world, the invisible plane that hovered just beyond torchlight. You shift your head slightly and watch as the healer blows softly across a line of ink she just pressed into the girl's skin. It's not about speed, it's about intention. Every mark made on the body is a conversation with what's inside and what's beyond. This in Nubia was the dual role of tattooing not just to restore, but to protect. They believed that the body was like a vessel through which both gods and spirits could move. And when someone fell ill, especially repeatedly, it meant something might be leaking in through a crack. Tattooing could seal those cracks. Certain symbols, especially ones shaped like coils, eyes or stylized birds, were believed to act as watchers, defenders perched permanently beneath the skin. Some of these marks were hidden in the crease of an arm or at the base of the spine. Others were placed proudly on the face or chest where spirits might first try to enter. The healer woman reaches into a carved wooden box and pulls out a tiny pouch. Inside is a powder made from burnt acacia bark and dried roots. She pinches a bit between her fingers and sprinkles it over the still bleeding dots. For the spirit, she whispers, "It is a protective offering. You probably wouldn't survive 1 week here without one of these, you realize, especially if the local spirits take a liking to foreigners." Even the placement of the tattoos told a story about their protective intent. Patterns etched along the lower back were thought to shield a woman during childbirth. Dots along the wrists and ankles could confuse malicious spirits trying to enter through the body's boundaries. Lines under the eyes for seeing through illusions. And across the shoulders, a sign that the wearer had endured grief and survived it. Pain was also part of the equation. It wasn't just tolerated, it was necessary. Just as the fever had to burn to release what afflicted the body, so did the sting of the needle offer passage for healing spirits to arrive. The moment the skin broke, it created a threshold. What passed through it, ink, chant, touch, mattered more than the pain itself. From time to time, a more serious healing session would call for group participation. If the illness was believed to come from a curse or a soul imbalance, the healer might gather others, family, neighbors, even other healers, to join in the ritual. Each person would bring an item of meaning, a stone, a strand of hair, a piece of cloth. The tattoo would then be done in silence, except for the slow, rhythmic humming or breathy chants, intended to confuse or deter the lingering spirit. You hear a soft drumbeat in the distance, barely audible over the rustling papyrus leaves. It's part of a neighboring ceremony, no doubt, but here in the hut, the work continues quietly. The healer finishes the girl's markings and sits back, wiping the bone needle clean with a square of linen. She examines her work not as an artist, but as a guardian, ensuring the protective geometry is exact, balanced, respectful. The girl's eyes flutter shut. You feel your own breath slow in rhythm with hers. Around you, the darkness of the desert presses in like a warm blanket. The spirits, if they had indeed gathered, seem satisfied, at least for now. And isn't it curious, you think, how healing in this world didn't just mean the body getting better, it meant the world itself being calmed. Illness was a ripple in the order of things, and to smooth it out, one had to touch not just the skin, but the world beyond it, with ink, with fire, with belief. You let your eyes close again. The girl is sleeping now. So is the healer, her arms folded gently around her knees. The flickering oil lamp dies down into a small orange glow. There are no beeping machines here, no bottles of pills, just silent symbols and the steady trust that what's unseen can be soothed. One tiny tattoo at a time. The role of ceremony and chant. You're back in the low light of that Nubian night. The desert wind hums gently outside the circular mud brick walls of the healer's home. Inside, the smell of burnt acacia bark and sweet myrrh thickens the air, swirling upward in lazy spirals. In the center of the room sits a young woman, bare-armed, and calm her eyes half-lidded, not from fear, but reverence. Beside her kneels the healer, an elder woman with braided gray hair, eyes as steady as the Nile, and a whispering voice that seems to carry the weight of generations. Tonight is not just a treatment. Tonight is a ritual. You see, in ancient Nubia, healing was never just about the body. It was about harmony between flesh, spirit, and cosmos. When pain visited the joints or the belly or the womb, it wasn't only a medical event. It was a disruption of balance. And to restore that balance, the healer's needle alone wasn't enough. That's where the chant came in. The ceremony would begin long before the first prick of ink touched skin. Sometimes it started at dawn with the patient fasting and bathing in river water steeped in lotus petals or desert herbs. At dusk, family members might sing low circular refrains outside the home soft phrases about rivers' fertility or protection. These weren't grand songs. They were repetitive near whispers like lullabies sung by the land itself. Inside, the healer ground burnt herbs into powder, mixing it with dark oil and resin in a carved stone bowl. As she did, she muttered short phrases under her breath. Were they prayers, recipes? Both. The boundary was thin here. Each word shaped intention. Each word softened fear. The tattooing tools, bone or ivory points, smoothened over time, were first laid out beside a small fire. The healer passed her hand over them, mumbling invocations to Sekhet, the lion-headed goddess of healing and war. Or perhaps to a local spirit, whose name never made it to any scroll or stele, but whose presence lingered in Nubian earth and fire. When the time came, the healer didn't simply say, "Now we begin." She sang it. The chant was slow. 4, maybe 5 notes repeated over and over like ripples on the Nile. She might call the pain by name, then sing it away. Or describe the illness as an animal and command it to leave the body. Some chants mentioned ancestors. Some borrowed Egyptian phrases but twisted them with local cadence. Ona, Ona, Sare, Maku, go, into the sand. Pain, go to the shadows. The patient often joined in quietly at first. Each syllable brought calm. Each breath became rhythmic, predictable. It steadied the heart. And that was important because the tattooing itself could take hours. With each insertion of the needle, the chant swelled and receded like desert wind. The pain was there, yes, but it became part of the song. A note in a melody older than kings. And there was rhythm in the hand, too. The healer didn't jab randomly. Her strikes were timed with the beat. 1, 2, pause. 1, 2, pause. Like drumming, like breath. The symbols she created, concentric circles for fertility spirals, for protection, sun lines for endurance, were not placed randomly either. Each had a meaning. Each was aligned with nerve points, or muscle lines, or spiritual currents, known only to those who'd apprenticed for years in silence. Sometimes incense smoke was used to trap the pain. A small clay dish of burning resin was held near the area being tattooed, and the chant would shift slightly, beckoning the smoke to pull the ache away. Did it work? Maybe not in the way modern medicine measures, but to the patient it did. The song said she was being healed. The smoke said the pain was not hers to carry. There were moments during these sessions deep into the night when the fire was dying down and the stars were fully awake, when the entire room felt like it existed outside of time. The walls didn't matter. The wind outside was miles away. All that existed was breath smoke and song. And then it would stop. The last mark would be made, the needle cleaned, the ink sealed with cool oil. And for a moment, no one would speak. The silence wasn't awkward. It was sacred. A silence earned. Only then would the healer press her hand gently against the new tattoo and whisper something no one else heard. A blessing, a farewell to the pain, or perhaps a reminder that this body now marked belonged again to itself. And finally, the patient would sleep. Deeply, with her wounds, her symbols, and the echo of chants in her dreams. It wasn't just a procedure. It was a lullaby written in skin. The wind is still across the sands tonight, and if you tilt your ear toward the deep hush of the ancient Nile's edge, you might just hear the memory of footsteps. Not yours, not mine, but of someone long gone. She was wrapped in linen laid to rest thousands of years ago, her bones still kissed by the sun-warmed dust of Nubia. And yet her body speaks. In this quiet hour, we find ourselves not in the land of the living, but among the carefully preserved dead mummies, whose skin, even after millennia, still bears the delicate intentional traces of tattooed lines. These aren't decorations in the modern sense. They're messages, clues, signs of lives lived with belief, with pain, with healing, with mystery. These mummies discovered in places like Gebel Adda and the now submerged village of Semna don't shout their secrets. They whisper them. Faint blue-black marks clustered near joints on the abdomen, sometimes just above the heart. Tiny patterns that, when studied under infrared light, reveal an entire medical language etched into the skin. One of the most well-known examples is a female mummy dating back to roughly 700 BCE. Her body was carefully buried, arms crossed, wrapped tightly in linen and resin. But what startled archaeologists wasn't just her preservation. It was the repeating motif of dots and crescents across her lower abdomen, an area long associated with menstruation, fertility, and childbirth. These weren't the kind of tattoos you'd boast about in a marketplace. They weren't for fashion. They were functional, intentional. Possibly painful to endure, yes, but their purpose wasn't to provoke. It was to protect, to soothe, to channel healing. When examined closely, the ink in these marks revealed high concentrations of carbon probably derived from soot, and traces of copper or lead-based minerals possibly added for their antibacterial properties. In effect, the tattoo was not just symbolic. It was medicinal. Scholars now believe that the position and ingredients suggest therapeutic aims. Chronic pelvic pain, uterine complications, perhaps even early forms of what we might now call acupuncture through ink. That's how specific these placements are, following the natural curves of the body, like someone reading a secret topography of illness. Another mummy this time, a man bore tattooed crosses on his elbows and knees. Strange, maybe, until you remember that these joints are common pain points, especially for those who performed repetitive labor. Was he a worker? A builder of stone walls? Perhaps even a soldier, we don't know. But his body tells us he had pain, and that someone tried to help him. And who were the ones doing the tattooing? Not strangers. Likely family members, trusted women healers. People who understood not just where it hurt, but why it mattered. And so, in soft light with hands steady from years of practice, they etched these signs of care into flesh, meant to last beyond the grave. The preservation of tattooed skin is rare, especially in desert climates where the skin dries, splits, and collapses over time. That we have these examples at all is a stroke of luck and a gift to history. They allow us to read the past not from scrolls or ruins, but from the literal bodies of its people. It's worth pausing here just for a breath to imagine this. You lying still, your loved ones gently tattooing symbols around your ailing joint. Not to harm, not to decorate, but to seal you with healing. No bright lights, no anesthesia. Just trust rhythm and belief. That slow act of faith in the body's ability to be soothed not by pills or surgery, but by ink and intention. Modern researchers now scan these remains using infrared photography CT scans and even ultraviolet light to identify faded patterns. What they find often mirrors the logic of acupressure points or natural healing zones, yet this was happening over 2,000 years before Western medicine began to formalize similar maps. And there's something beautifully circular in that. We spend so much time trying to invent new answers to old problems. Pain, sickness, injury. And yet sometimes the solutions, however humble, have been sitting quietly in the earth, waiting to be noticed, waiting to be read again. So if you're drifting off now, let your imagination settle into those ancient tombs. Cool, quiet, gently wrapped in time. And think of the people who marked each other with care, not because it was trendy or forbidden or wild, but because it was necessary. Because healing, whether through ink or herb or chant, was part of being human. Even in death, these tattooed bodies remind us that healing doesn't always mean curing. Sometimes it simply means remembering where it hurt, and that someone tried to help. From Nubia to Egypt and back. Now that you're deep in the folds of ancient Nubia, relaxed and tucked beneath soft linen sheets, imagine the long, winding Nile stretching far beyond the quiet villages we've explored so far. Its slow-moving waters curve northward, cradling not just boats and fish, but also ideas. Over generations, stories, rituals, pigments, and symbols moved silently along this liquid road, flowing between Nubia and its more famous northern neighbor, Egypt. While most of what we know about ancient Egyptian medicine has been told in the grandeur of papyrus scrolls and gold leaf tombs, Nubian influence often drifted like a breeze beneath the pages present, but rarely seen. And yet, when we look closer at the ink pressed into the skin of both Nubians and Egyptians, we find a dialogue, not a monologue, a quiet exchange, a soft, centuries-long conversation conducted not with loud proclamations, but with whispers carried on the skin. You see, tattooing in ancient Egypt has often been attributed to religious or symbolic meaning, particularly among women. Many well-preserved Egyptian mummies, especially those from the Middle Kingdom onward, bear tattoos around the lower abdomen, thighs, and breasts. These designs weren't just ornamental. They were believed to be linked to fertility protection during childbirth, or to offer divine favor. Sound familiar? Yes. These same themes echoed in Nubian traditions, but there's compelling evidence to suggest they predated Egyptian tattooing, at least in therapeutic use. Scholars now believe the practice may have flowed upstream from the Nubian south to the Egyptian north. Nubians were older in some of their customs than their more widely recognized neighbors. Nubian healers, especially, women often traveled with merchant caravans or worked as part of noble households in Egypt. Their skills were valued particularly in the realms of midwifery and spiritual healing. And sometimes they brought their inks with them. But the influence wasn't one way. The Egyptians, too, had their own sacred medicines, pigments, and gods. Imagine a Nubian healer learning about Isis, the goddess of healing and motherhood, and adapting Egyptian symbols into her tattooing practice. A lotus flower here, an eye of Horus there. These small design shifts weren't just artistic. They were spiritual passports, granting her access to the Egyptian pantheon while preserving her native power. It's in this liminal space between borders, between languages, between beliefs, that tattooing evolved in ways both practical and profound. You can almost picture a Nubian healer sitting with an Egyptian noblewoman. Maybe she's been struggling with difficult pregnancies. The healer mixes pigment from both traditions' myrrh, from Thebes ash, from the Nubian tamarisk tree, and slowly etches protection beneath her skin. A mark that speaks in 2 languages. It's also worth noting that trade along the Nile wasn't limited to gold ivory or lapis lazuli. Medicines moved too. Bundled herbs, powdered roots, balms, stored in palm leaf pouches. Many of these ingredients became part of tattoo inks. Imagine black cumin oil infused in soot and applied to aching joints. Or blue woad, yes, the same kind used centuries later by Celts, ground into a cooling pigment for inflammation. These weren't random choices. They were layered in centuries of observation and experience. And yet over time, as Egypt grew in power and wrote its own stories in stone, much of Nubia's knowledge was buried literally and figuratively. Egypt's dominance in the historical record meant that Nubian tattooing became a forgotten whisper in the archive. When archaeologists first discovered inked Egyptian mummies, few stopped to ask where the practice might have come from. It was attributed to divine culture, to the brilliance of the Nile Delta. But now, thanks to closer studies of Nubian remains, particularly those from sites like Qasr Ibrim and Gebel Adda, we know better. We know that even as Egypt conquered Nubia militarily, the cultural exchange flowed in both directions. And in the realm of skin, Nubia left its mark. Quite literally. There's something intimate about this flow of ink between cultures, isn't there? It's not the loud clang of war or the roar of chariots. It's the soft, precise tap of bone on flesh, the whisper of breath as pigment sinks into skin, and the way a person might sleep a little easier, knowing a healing symbol lies beneath their ribs. As you drift now under your own soft cover, think of how ideas float on water, how knowledge hides in plain sight, and how even in the towering shadow of pyramids, the quiet art of Nubian healing ink found a way to glow faint but steady like embers beneath ash. The sun rises slowly over the dunes of Nubia, and even now, thousands of years later, you can almost feel its gentle warmth on your skin. That same sun once filtered through reeds and clay-latticed walls, casting golden ripples across the bodies of those marked with quiet strength. Because in ancient Nubia, healing wasn't just about restoring health. It was about identity, about place, about the story etched into your skin beneath the sun, God's ever-watchful light. Tattoos weren't something people hid. They were proudly worn across collarbones, arms, thighs, and bellies. Each mark a thread in the woven tapestry of someone's life. And for many, the patterns weren't merely beautiful. They told of survival, of endurance, of a body shaped by both hardship and healing. In this land of bright skies and fertile riverbanks, ink was medicine. But it was also declaration, protection, prayer. The ancient Nubians didn't separate the body from the cosmos. You weren't just a physical being, you were a vessel of spirit family and celestial energy. And so each tattoo wasn't random or fashionable. It was mapped to meaning. A spiral along the lower back could invoke fertility and support childbirth. Dots along the rib cage might ward off lung ailments. Crescent shapes on the thighs could relate to the moon menstrual cycles, or even midwifery traditions passed from mother to daughter. And then there was the sun. The Nubians, like their Egyptian neighbors to the north, revered the solar deities, especially Ra, whose eye watched from the heavens. To walk under the sun without protection was to risk imbalance. So some tattoos served as a kind of spiritual sunscreen solar symbols, placed on the chest, upper arms, and even on the nape of the neck. The goal wasn't to shield from burns, of course, but from misfortune illness, or energy that scorched rather than warmed. The sun could heal crops, but also bring drought. Balance was everything. Tattoos could honor that balance. A young woman preparing for marriage might be adorned with delicate ink spirals on her hips, believed to strengthen her womb, protect her from miscarriage, and align her body with the solar rhythms of life. An elder warrior now retired might bear faded marks along his shoulders, protection in battle, but also a permanent sign of peace earned and pain endured. What's fascinating is that these tattoos were rarely solo affairs. They were communal, observed, remembered. After a healing tattoo was administered through slow puncture and song, it became part of the village's memory. Others knew your mark. They knew what it meant. Maybe they'd seen the fever you overcame or the back pain that once left you hunched. The tattoo wasn't just for you, it was for others too. A living symbol of transformation under the sun. Now imagine it. The patient sits in the shade of a date palm, their skin slick with plant-based balm. The healer chants softly, not for show, but because the rhythm calms, the breath centers the spirit. Nearby children play in the shallows of the Nile, unaware that the woman beside the healer is being marked for protection after childbirth. She has survived something dangerous, and now she is choosing not to hide it. Her tattoo is a quiet triumph, a way of saying, I am still here. There's something else worth noting, how the skin aged with these marks. Time would fade them, stretch them, but they never disappeared completely. Elders became walking testaments to the body's relationship with healing. Wrinkles passed over lines of ink. Stretch marks expanded spirals. The result, a lifelong journal legible only to those who listened with care. Tattoos also helped bridge generations. A grandmother's mark might be replicated, slightly altered, on her daughter's arm. Not copied in vanity, but inherited with meaning. Maybe that same grandmother once received it after a scorpion sting, and now her granddaughter bears it as protection for long treks through dry terrain. The pattern shifts, slightly evolving, but the heartbeat of the story stays the same. In the light of day, these stories weren't always spoken aloud, but they didn't need to be. The ink did the talking, and in that way, tattoos became a language unto themselves, one of wounds and recovery, of cycles and sunrises. The healer's ink wasn't just pigment, it was lineage. And when the day closed again, and the Nubian sky turned that deep indigo velvet, you could sometimes catch a glimpse of the tattoos by firelight, flickering, glistening barely there, like constellations on skin. You'd almost expect them to whisper. Some said the tattoos held warmth even in old age, that the marks once applied with sting and ash gave off a kind of quiet heat in the cold desert night. Whether true or just an old tale, it made sense in this world where body and cosmos were never apart. So as the sun god dipped low over the Nile, and as women adjusted their veils or men wrapped their shoulders for sleep, those tattoos did not fade into night. They lingered, like memories, like stories waiting to be told again. The candlelight dances quietly in the tomb. Tonight we lie beside a woman who has not breathed in over 3,000 years. And yet her body speaks. We're deep in a burial chamber carved into the desert rock near the banks of the Nile, in what was once the kingdom of Nubia. The air is still but not stale. Rather, it feels weighted with time. You can almost hear the river's distant lull, the soft rhythm that might have sung her to sleep centuries ago. Her skin preserved by heat, and time bears marks, lines, dots, and repeating patterns on her lower back, on her wrists, around her navel. You don't need to be an expert to sense their intention. These weren't ornamental flourishes for beauty alone. No, they were functional, communicative, protective. They told a story of pain, power, and healing. Archaeologists discovered her in the early 20th century. Her body, curled gently in a fetal position, was so well preserved that even now you can trace the ink beneath her parchment-thin skin. At first, scholars assumed the marks were decorative, but over the decades, as more tattooed mummies were uncovered in this region, a new picture emerged. This was medicine on the skin. Let's take a moment to really imagine her life. Perhaps she was a mother. Many of these tattooed remains are women, often middle-aged. Maybe she bore multiple children with the expected toll of childbirth cramps and joint pain. The patterns around her pelvis may have been applied to alleviate menstrual discomfort. The ink on her wrists, maybe it was there to ease repetitive movement from grinding grain, weaving, or carrying baskets of water. One woman found at the site of Gebel Ada in Lower Nubia had a dense cluster of tattoos on her lower spine. Scientists used infrared imaging to reveal faint outlines invisible to the naked eye. The patterns aligned perfectly with what we now understand as pain point spots, where people today receive acupuncture, pressure therapy, or even transdermal patches. Could these ancient Nubians have understood the body's energy centers long before modern anatomy? We lie still beside her in the dark, and in the silence she shares her truth. What's remarkable is how these tattoos weren't random. There was consistency across bodies, across generations. A certain pattern on the thigh here. A looping curve over the sacrum there. These weren't the result of whim or fad. They followed a system, a logic we are only beginning to decode. Some of the women bore symbols associated with gods or spiritual forces. For instance, the goddess Bes, protector of women in childbirth, was sometimes represented by stylized symbols tattooed on bellies and hips. Imagine lying on a woven mat, the smell of burning herbs in the air, while a healer presses her inked tool into your skin, not just to ward off illness, but to call down divine protection during your most vulnerable moments. And while we can't ask these women directly, their bodies hint at something profound, that being tattooed was not a marginal act. It was central. It meant healing, power, belonging. One mummy from the region of El Kuru had tattoos shaped like dots and dashes across her abdomen and upper thighs. When radiologists scanned her, they found evidence of arthritis in the knees and hips. The tattoos corresponded eerily with the inflamed joints beneath. The placement wasn't decorative, it was diagnostic. Lie back now. Breathe deeply. You can almost hear the past whispering. These weren't procedures done in haste. They took hours, sometimes days. The skin had to be cleaned, the tools prepared with care. Pain was part of the process, but it wasn't feared. It was a portal. Pain meant something was shifting inside and out. And once the ink healed, it remained. A permanent talisman. A record of ailment and answer. A map of resilience etched into flesh. You might imagine how a mother passed her tattoos down to her daughter, not just in story, but in pattern. This here, she might have whispered, touching a line on her hip helped me walk, when the rains came and my joints ached. And so her daughter would carry the same mark, an heirloom of wellness and wisdom. There are no books from these women, no surviving diaries or doctor's notes. But they wrote in other ways. They wrote with needles and smoke, with soot and hope, with pigment and pain and faith. Tonight we're not merely looking at old bones, We're eavesdropping on a medical tradition older than most countries, a language of the body, a history of healing passed from skin to skin. So when you think of ancient medicine, don't picture only herbs or potions. Think of tattoos warmed by the desert sun, pressed gently by steady hands, meant to draw out pain and call in peace. Because long before hospitals and white coats, there were women in Nubia, working by oil lamp light, marking the skin with symbols of survival. And their patience, they carried those marks into death, into time, into our imagination. Their story is quiet, but not forgotten. You lie still, your breathing slow, and even now, as we journey gently into the far reaches of time, into echoes that hum softly beneath the skin. Picture a woman in a dimly lit hut near the bend of the Nile centuries ago, her hands marked with fine dots and crossing lines. She holds a polished sliver of bone in one hand and a shallow bowl of dark ink in the other. She hums softly, nothing hurried, nothing harsh. Around her, other women sit in silence, some in recovery, others waiting. The air smells of burned herbs and damp soil. But this isn't just an image from the past. Tonight, we quietly trace the thread from those ancient healing tattoos to now. You might think of tattoos as rebellion or art, or maybe just a modern aesthetic choice. But in remote parts of North Africa, in certain indigenous communities, and even in quietly resurging traditions, the memory of Nubian tattooing still lingers gentle as a whisper. In the highlands of Ethiopia, older women once bore dots across their jaws, and chins said to ward off evil spirits. Berber women in the Maghreb traced lines across their foreheads and wrists for fertility and safe passage through childbirth. Some marks mirrored illness, like placing dots along the temples for migraines, or lines near joints for arthritis. Though modern medicine had long since overshadowed these practices, the intention remains strikingly similar: to heal not just the body, but the spirit, the story and the place of the person within their world. Anthropologists have quietly studied these traditions, though always with respectful caution. These aren't museum artifacts. They're living stories passed from mother to daughter, not always spoken, but etched just beneath the skin. In Sudan, some elders still remember their grandmothers receiving tattoos during times of illness. The soot was mixed with henna or crushed medicinal leaves, then tapped gently into the skin while prayers were whispered. One woman recalled her grandmother's hand marked with a series of dots along her wrist, meant to ease tremors and anxiety. She would run her fingers along those marks like prayer beads during difficult times. Even in diaspora communities far from their Nubian roots, tattooing has taken on renewed meaning. Not necessarily as a revival of exact patterns or rituals, but as a reconnection to a deeper lineage. A way of saying, I remember even if I don't know exactly how. And modern tattoo artists, some consciously, others unknowingly, have echoed this philosophy. There are artists today who focus on trauma healing through ink. They design symbols that reclaim the body after loss or abuse. Some draw directly from ancient African symbols, channeling lines that once lived on Nubian skin. The science, too, begins to circle back. There's renewed interest in the physiological effects of tattooing, not just the stress relief some people report, but how pigments interact with the immune system. Some studies hint that tattoos might stimulate immune responses, helping the body regulate inflammation. It's not yet medicine, but perhaps thousands of years ago, Nubian women knew more than we've ever given them credit for. And isn't that often the case? The deeper we look into the practices of so-called lost civilizations, the more we find quiet wisdom, subtle knowledge, and a profound respect for the bond between the physical and the spiritual. Nubian tattooing wasn't just about fixing a fever or soothing pain. It was about naming pain, giving it form, marking the journey of a person in visible, wearable ways. And though many of those patterns have faded from the skin, they remain etched in oral stories, in museum bones, in quiet hands, lighting incense in desert villages, and just maybe in the unspoken ritual of someone somewhere deciding to mark their healing with ink. There's something timeless about that, isn't there? You rest now surrounded by echoes. Echoes of bone tools and hushed chants. Echoes of women who believed that ink could shield you, guide you, soothe you. That to mark the body was to honor the struggle. And that healing could be soft, slow, and sacred. The sleepy magic of ancient ink. Let's drift one last time beneath the Nubian sky. The stars shimmer like beads of silver scattered across an indigo cloth. The wind sighs gently through the reeds near the river bank, and the rhythmic hush of the Nile murmurs like a lullaby. The night is still and thick with warmth scented by the faint traces of wood smoke, dried herbs, and sandalwood. In a small mud brick home lit by flickering oil lamps, a healer kneels beside a woman's outstretched leg. Her hands are weathered and strong, but her touch is gentle, careful, practiced. Before her rests a carved wooden tray on it, a sharpened bone needle, a small stone bowl of inky paste, made from burnt tamarisk bark and gum acacia, and a palm leaf fan to keep away insects. There's no rush. Everything unfolds slowly, with quiet reverence. The patient lies still, not because the pain is absent, but because she trusts the hands that wield it. The healer hums softly, a low melodic tone, barely rising above the whisper of the flame. Her chants are not elaborate, but steady, one word repeated over and over like a heartbeat. Sant, sant, sant. Peace, peace, peace. She dips the bone into the ink, then presses it gently into the skin, marking just below the knee, where the woman has felt stiffness and ache. Each tap is deliberate, each dot a promise. A string of dots curves around the leg like a river, a reminder of motion, of flow, of healing. This is more than art. It is language. It is medicine. It is history. No one hurries. Not in Nubia. Not under this sky. The healer's daughter barely 10 watches from the shadows, mimicking the motions with her fingers in the air. One day she too will know these patterns, not from books, but from memory, from rhythm, from skin. The night deepens. Outside, the moon casts silver patterns across the sand, and the palms bow gently in the wind as if listening. You imagine the sounds around you, the whisper of ink mixing the soft thap-thap of the bone needle, the gentle exhale of the patient, the rustle of linen robes. The atmosphere is timeless, suspended between yesterday and forever. And as the healer moves from leg to wrist to shoulder, each dot placed with care and intention, you realize this healing was never just about medicine. Not here. Healing was touch. Healing was story. Healing was trust, etched into skin. Some marks meant fertility placed near the hips. Others promised protection drawn across the sternum like a guardian's shield. Still others served as reminders of grief, of endurance, of births and recoveries, and years of drought. Each body became a quiet scroll of a life lived with purpose and pain and beauty. You wonder how many bodies told stories like this, and how many still do. The healer finishes her work with a final press of cloth soaked in warm resin water. She whispers a word of thanks, not to a god necessarily, but to the process, the lineage, the quiet thread of women before her. She rests her hands gently on the patient's shoulders. There's no prescription, no pill. Just quiet, rest, and belief. As the lamps flicker out one by one, the room grows darker, but not cold. The night wraps around everything like a woven blanket, tight, soft, and familiar. Somewhere far in the future, an archaeologist will dust off a rib cage and pause. She'll see the faded dots along a scapula, perfectly aligned, and wonder what they meant. She'll write in her notebook, "Patterned ink, medicinal intent likely. Early Nubian period." But here tonight you know exactly what it meant. You saw it happen. You felt the silence. You heard the chant. And now, as the last ember in the oil lamp dies into darkness, and the healer finally rests her head against the wall, with a satisfied sigh, you let yourself breathe out with her. Let your own limbs grow heavy. Let your mind slow. The tattoos have been placed. The story has been told. And in the soft warmth of an ancient desert night, your sleep begins.